So the Morlocks first appeared in Uncanny X-Men issue number 169, and with the first introduction of the Morlocks, the story turns out to be pretty straightforward. There really is no reference point in terms of us jumping to a previous event. What we see with this story is that we pick up with, again, the girlfriend of Warren Worthington, Candy Southern. And Candy Southern has arrived back at the apartment of Warren Worthington only to find that Warren Worthington has vanished. She doesn't know where he is. But when she looks around the apartment, she notices that, of course, some of his feathers are lying about, and there's also some blood indicating that maybe there was a conflict that led in him being taken against his will to some other location. In addition, she also realizes that there's somebody moving around the apartment, although she doesn't know who it is. But because she's currently trapped upstairs, she goes to the phone and uses the speed dial to contact Professor Charles Xavier. She tells Charles Xavier that something's gone wrong, that somebody's taken Warren Worthington, but before she can elaborate too much further, she's surprised from behind by a man who calls himself Sunder and tells her that he's explicitly here to hurt her. After this, we switch to Charles Xavier as he contacts, Nightcrawler. And Nightcrawler, of course, is spending time with a romantic interest of his own. But when he's telepathically informed by Charles Xavier that someone's taken Warren Worthington, and they've presumably taken him somewhere relatively close around there, Nightcrawler immediately takes off and uses the time to try to recon the immediate area to see whether or not he can spot Warren Worthington. He's successful in locating Warren. He's apparently being taken down into a sewer, but before Nightcrawler can again continue to investigate and follow the group that's taken Warren Worthington, he is surprised by the fact that Candy Southern's being thrown out of a window, and so he has to divert his attention to Candy Southern in order to save her life. From here, we transition to the rest of the X-Men that are inside the apartment of Warren Worthington, or I'm sorry, of Nightcrawler, that are also doing what they can to comfort Candy Southern. And again, this is the reason why we had touched back on the events that led up to the formation of X-Factor and the current state of the X-Men, because during this time, X-Factor is still off doing its own thing. And so Beast, Iceman, Bobby Drake, Cameron Hodge, Jean Grey, they're all off doing their own separate situation. And so that's the reason why we don't see them here. But what we are joined with is Nightcrawler, is Colossus, Kitty Pryde, Storm, and what they're doing is they're trying to plan a course of action. They're trying to figure out what it is they're going to do with regards to Warren Worthington. But as time progresses, the group decides to go after Warren to attempt a rescue of some sort. And this leads them down into the sewer system. But as they progress further and further into the sewers, through the subways and so on, they're eventually ambushed by a group of mutants. Now, over the course of this, they're able to make their escape, but in the process, Kitty Pryde is lost. She somehow ends up becoming separated from the group. But while she's separated from the group, she comes into contact with a person named Plague. Now, Plague is a name that I would really like for you to keep in the back of your head, and the reason why is because while the Morlocks play background roles following this story, their introduction and the Mutant Massacre, Plague will become one of the original four horsemen of the apocalypse. And so it's very important that we keep this trend going in terms of remembering this particular character as well as Caliban, who we'll see later on. But from here, we switch back to the X-Men as they're continuing about their investigations. But ultimately, they come into contact with the group of Morlocks proper. And when they come into contact with this group, we of course see that the group is being led by a person named Callisto. Now, what Callisto tells the X-Men is that she has kidnapped Warren Worthington for the purpose of taking him as a mate, somebody that can, live alongside her as an equal in terms of her perspective. Now, Colossus' original idea here is that maybe she did this out of love, but Storm says no. Storm says that this was done out of desire, that because Callisto doesn't really even know Warren, there's no possible way that she could say she's in love with him. It's simply just that she desires an equal. She desires a mate. Now, initially, the X-Men take it upon themselves to confront the Morlocks and to begin the process of fighting the Morlocks. But again, individuals like Colossus are a little hesitant here. And in fact, Colossus goes as far as to say that he's pulling punches, that he doesn't necessarily want to injure any of the Morlocks. He doesn't want to hurt them because as far as he knows, they're doing this against their will, that they don't really know what it is they're engaging in, that perhaps they've been duped or they've been tricked by Callisto. From here, as events progress in the introduction of the Morlocks, we transition over to issue number 170. And with issue number 170, we again continue this story. We of course had previously seen that that Kitty Pryde was in turn rescued by Caliban. And Caliban, of course, is one of the Morlocks and a mutant with the ability to sense the location of other mutants, but Caliban also has a romantic interest in Kitty Pryde. And so with this story, we pick up as Kitty Pryde as she's coming to, as she's realizing that perhaps she's in some location, but she doesn't know exactly what it is that's going on here. Eventually, it's revealed to her that Caliban has rescued her, and her intention is to have Caliban take her to the location of the other X-Men so that she can attempt to help rescue them. But as time progresses, again, the X-Men are continuing their conflict, and during this process, Storm is touched by Plague. And because Storm is touched by Plague, Plague tells the X-Men that Storm will simply just be sick for a temporary amount of time, but that if Plague touches her again, that Storm will die. And so while the X-Men have Callisto subdued, Plague says that if the X-Men release Callisto, that Plague will not kill Storm. Of course, because the X-Men are, for the most part, benign in nature and that they don't want to kill anybody, of course, the X-Men release Callisto. From here, Callisto takes the X-Men prisoner, and of course, Caliban, seeing that Kitty Pryde is beginning to succumb to her illness, takes Kitty Pryde to Plague in the hopes that Plague will be able to cure Kitty Pryde of the illness that is killing her. But when Colossus, who of course at this time has an interest in Kitty Pryde, sees that she's injured, he immediately goes into an enraged state. Of course, turning into his organic metal form once again, he breaks free of his bonds and tells the Morlocks that if anything should happen to Kitty Pryde, that he will kill them. From here, what we see is that again, as things progress, Storm is informed that the only way for her to become free of her situation, to escape the orders of Callisto, is for her to defeat Callisto in combat. Now also, Nightcrawler hears this, and the initial idea is that Nightcrawler is going to be the one to fight Callisto to free Kitty Pryde and the rest of the X-Men, but Storm tells him no. Storm says that because she's the leader of the X-Men and Callisto is a leader of the Morlocks, it's only proper that Storm be the one that fight Callisto for control of the Morlocks. And so of course we see that both Storm and Callisto engage in combat, and Callisto sets the terms by saying that Storm cannot use any of her powers. And so as the two of them begin to fight, it seems as though maybe Callisto is gaining the upper hand, but almost immediately Storm is successful in defeating Callisto. And so this brings a situation whereby Storm, as the leader of the X-Men, is also the leader of the Morlocks. And using her power, she tells of course the X-Men to retreat and to free Warren Worthington, and they travel back to the X-Men, or back to the Xavier Institute, and of course I guess release Warren Worthington back to X Factor. Now from here, the Morlocks are going to remain somewhat of a background theme. They're going to appear sporadically, periodically within the Marvel Comics, but it won't be until the Mutant Massacre story that we will see the Morlocks rise to prominence once more and become a mainstay within the Marvel Comics universe. So following the Morlocks' first appearance in Uncanny X-Men issue number 169 in 1983, Marvel followed up 3 years later in 1986 with a story called The Mutant Massacre. Now the Mutant Massacre was a huge event in the realm of Marvel Comics. First and foremost, it was big because it was the first time we had ever seen a crossover involving all of the X-Men related titles, X-Men, X-Factor, the New Mutants. But what Marvel had also done with the Mutant Massacre is they had brought in Thor. Now, as far as I can tell, the reason why Marvel had done this, despite the fact that Thor was not part of the X-Men or any of the X-Men related teams, was because Marvel was a little unsure as to whether or not this gamble would pay off. Marvel was dumping a lot of resources. They were in effect throwing in the New Mutants. They were throwing in X-Factor. They were throwing in X-Force. Chris Claremont, Louise Simonson, these were all going into the efforts of creating this crossover event. But Marvel didn't know if a crossover between Louise Simonson and Chris Claremont would be enough to draw readership. And so by including Thor, one of Marvel's most prominent characters, Marvel was going to basically reach out to those who weren't necessarily familiar with the X-Men or X-Factor related titles and give them a reason to come into this situation and to read this crossover event. In addition, with the Mutant Massacre, we also saw the introduction of Gambit in terms of why it was he was involved in this. Now, Gambit's introduction with the Mutant Massacre wouldn't come until some years after after the Mutant Massacre event, but Marvel used the Mutant Massacre as a way to explain Gambit's existence in the Marvel Universe at that particular point in time. And what Marvel did here is they had basically said that Gambit had been duped into initiating, or I guess leading, the Mutant Massacre. Although at the time when the comic was originally published, Gambit hadn't been created, and so he wasn't part of the Mutant Massacre event. But what Marvel had done here with this story is they had instigated a scenario with the Marauders, a group that was later revealed to have been led by Sinister, into injuring one of the Morlocks and then following that Morlock back to the New York tunnels. When they found the location of where the Morlocks were hiding at, the Marauders began the conquest of killing all the Morlocks off. Later on, the X-Men, X-Factor, and the New Mutants and Thor joined, but what we saw with their involvement here is that very rarely they crossed paths. That is to say, the X-Men were in the tunnels, the X-Factor was in the tunnels, New Mutants was in the tunnels, and Thor were in the tunnels, but X-Men and X-Factor never crossed paths. They didn't know the other was there. And so while their losses were fairly substantial, the Morlocks, of course, were even worse. But in the end, they were able to save a portion of the Morlocks from total extermination. Now, in Cable issue number 28, Marvel began the process of revealing to us that perhaps Mr. Sinister had a hand in the Morlock massacre, because again, at this time, we didn't know why this had happened. During Chris Claremont's entire run of the X-Men, it was never explained why the Morlock massacre had taken place. It had simply just happened, and it had come to an end. Now, at the end of the Morlock massacre story, Psylocke had looked into the mind of a Sabretooth and believed that maybe there was a hidden hand behind this, but again, this shadowy figure, this hidden hand, was never revealed. In Cable issue number 28, during a conflict with Sugarman, Sinister had observed Sugarman and seen that perhaps there was some instance of Sinister's own genetic manipulation in Sugarman himself, and all Sinister did was touch back on the idea of eliminating those whose genetic imprint could be found within both Sinister and these individuals, a common trait. Now, after the Age of Apocalypse event, Marvel retconned all of this, and what Marvel did is they came back and said that the Morlocks were the result of tampering at the hands of Dark Beast, the Age of Apocalypse version of Beast who had managed to escape the timeline. But of course, again, this is simply just one of these instances whereby Marvel makes things a little confusing. And with the Morlocks, Marvel could afford to do this because, again, the Morlocks, while they appeared in some significant stories, were never top billing. They were always background characters. In 2001, Marvel had expanded on this a little bit, and they had released a series called Morlocks, which showed us that there were other Morlocks around the world. With Uncanny X-Men issues number 397 to 399, Marvel had given us a story whereby we saw again other Morlocks in London. But for the most part, Marvel kept the Morlocks relegated to background characters. Marvel would simply just show us that the Morlocks were still in existence, but there were never really any major events involving them. Now, the closest that we got to a huge event aside from the Mutant Massacre was in 2005 during the Decimation story, the event that took place after the House of M, which dealt with the fallout of the mutant population, with only 198 being able to retain their powers. And with this, all we really saw was that Caliban was one of the Morlocks who had traveled back to the Xavier Institute to seek refuge, to seek protection from humans who would attempt to eliminate what was left of the mutant population. We also saw during the event called Son of M, whereby Quicksilver had traveled to the inhuman city of Attilan and captured the Terrigen crystals in order to bring people's powers back, had used Callisto as the first person to have her powers reinstated of the mutants who had lost their abilities. But because Callisto had the ability to, have enhanced senses, the Terrigen crystals had sent her powers into overdrive and had effectively made her go insane. And so, of course, we saw Magneto arrive and take Callisto away in order to help her cope with her abilities as well as regain her sanity. But again, this is just another instance whereby Marvel had simply appeared and told us that the Morlocks were still around, they just simply weren't part of any huge stories. Now, in terms of the Age of Apocalypse, the reason why we're again talking about the Morlocks is because while the Morlocks were not part of the Age of Apocalypse event proper, that is to say the 1995 event, Marvel came back in 2005 and they did a 10-year anniversary for the Age of Apocalypse, and they showed us the expanded universe of the Age of Apocalypse, that timeline that involved more than the initial groups that we had seen during the 1995 event. And among these groups, we saw the Morlocks, and the Morlocks were expanded upon. They were given more information in terms of our perception of them, but again, this is just another example of them being relegated to the background. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.